Chapter 1. The Call at 1:00 a.m. The hotel room smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the kind of smell that never quite left no matter how expensive the place tried to be. Greg Foster sat on the edge of the bed, jacket draped neatly over the chair, tie already loosened and folded with care on the desk. Outside the window, the city hummed softly, distant traffic, a siren somewhere far away, the muted glow of streetlights reflecting off rain-dark pavement. It was 1:00 a.m. exactly. Greg glanced at the clock on his phone, more out of habit than concern. He had just finished reviewing spreadsheets for the third time that night. Not because they needed it, but because keeping his hands busy kept his mind steady. Work trips were always like this, long days, quiet nights, and a strange emptiness that crept in once the tasks were done. He picked up his phone again and scrolled to Alicia's name. Wife. The word still carried weight for him. Routine, comfort, familiarity. He called her most nights when he traveled. Not because he was suspicious. Not because he needed reassurance. It was simply what they did. A check-in. A small ritual to remind each other that distance was temporary. The phone rang once. Twice. On the third ring, it was answered. Hey. A man's voice said, casual, unbothered. She's busy right now. She'll call you later. For half a second, Greg thought he had misheard. Hotel rooms did that sometimes, muffled sounds, strange echoes. He pulled the phone slightly away from his ear and checked the screen. Alicia. He brought it back. There was no mistaking the voice this time. Calm. Familiar. Too familiar. Dominic? Greg asked quietly, not accusing, just confirming. A pause. Not long, but not immediate either. The kind of pause where someone decides whether pretending will help or hurt. Then a chuckle. Yeah, man, it's me. In the background, faint but unmistakable, came a woman's laugh. Light, carefree. Alicia's laugh. The one Greg had heard for years across dinner tables, during late-night movies, when something amused her just enough to make her tilt her head back slightly. The sound landed in his chest like a weight, but it didn't explode. It settled. Greg stood up slowly and walked to the window, phone still pressed to his ear. He looked down at the street below, at people who had no idea his life had just split cleanly in two. She's busy, Greg repeated. Yeah, Dominic said easily. We're talking. Another laugh in the background. Closer this time, as if she had leaned toward the phone, curious. Greg closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't picture them together. He didn't imagine details. He had learned a long time ago that imagination was a luxury anger enjoyed. He wasn't interested in that. Instead, he focused on his breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, measured. Dominic mistook the silence for shock. Listen, man, he continued, his tone shifting into something that almost sounded apologetic. This wasn't planned. It just happened. Greg opened his eyes. Did it? He asked softly. Another pause. This one longer. In the background, the laughter stopped. There was a rustle, like fabric moving, a quiet whisper Greg couldn't make out. Alicia was close enough to hear him now. She hadn't taken the phone. She hadn't said his name. That told him more than any confession could. Greg leaned his free hand against the cold glass of the window. He felt strangely detached, as if he were watching this unfold from a distance, like a scene in a movie he'd already decided wasn't worth rewinding. You know, Dominic said, trying to regain control. We didn't want to hurt you. Greg almost smiled. Almost. Dominic, Greg said calmly, his voice even, put her on the phone. Another whisper. Urgent this time. Then Dominic exhaled. She doesn't want to talk right now. There it was. Not can't. Won't. Greg nodded slowly, even though no one could see him. The pieces aligned with a quiet finality. No shouting. No pleading. No confusion left to resolve. Okay, Greg said. Dominic hesitated. Okay, what? Greg's grip on the phone loosened slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was gentle, not sarcastic, not loud, just final. Keep her, he said. She's your problem now. The words hung in the air, heavier than any insult could have been. What? Dominic blurted out. I'm done, Greg continued, as if explaining a simple decision. I won't argue. I won't compete. I won't chase. In the background, Alicia finally spoke, her voice sharp and startled. "Greg." He didn't let her finish. "Greg," ended the call. The screen went dark, reflecting his face faintly back at him. Calm, pale, controlled. He stood there for a long moment, phone still in his hand, listening to the quiet hum of the room. His heart was beating faster now, but not wildly. It was the steady rhythm of a man who had just stepped off a ledge and realized the fall was already over. He placed the phone face down on the desk. No text followed. No calls. He didn't check. Instead, Greg reached for his jacket and slipped it on with deliberate care. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted his watch, and glanced once more around the room. Nothing here belonged to him in any meaningful way. He grabbed his keys, not with anger, not with desperation, with clarity. And as he turned off the light and walked toward the door, Greg Foster already knew he wouldn't be staying another night. Chapter 2. The drive back as a different man. The parking garage echoed softly as Greg walked toward his car, the sound of his shoes striking concrete steady and unhurried. He placed his bag in the trunk, closed it with a muted thud, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine right away. The dashboard clock glowed faintly in the dark. 1:27 a.m. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and stared forward. Nothing chased him out of the hotel. No panic, no urge to slam doors or speed recklessly into the night. He had simply decided to leave. Staying no longer made sense. The engine turned over smoothly, obedient like it always had. Greg eased out of the garage and onto the highway, the city thinning behind him as the road opened up into long, empty stretches of asphalt. Streetlights passed in a steady rhythm, illuminating the hood of the car and then slipping away again, one after another. He didn't turn on the radio. Silence felt appropriate. Greg's phone sat in the cup holder, screen dark. He didn't look at it. He already knew what was waiting there. Missed calls, explanations formed too late, words that would ask him to soften what had already hardened. He wasn't ready to hear any of it. And more importantly, he didn't need to. His mind was strangely clear. He thought about the first year of his marriage, how proud he had been to wear a ring, about the way he used to brag about Alicia to co-workers, about how he turned down drinks after work because he wanted to get home to her. He remembered picking up extra contracts so she could quit a job she hated. Remembered telling himself that love was proven through consistency, through showing up even when it wasn't exciting. He had done all of that without keeping score. And now, driving alone through the dark, he realized something quietly unsettling. They had kept score for him. Greg had always been the reliable one, the calm one, the man people leaned on because they assumed he could carry the weight without complaint. He had mistaken that assumption for respect. Somewhere along the way, it had become invisibility. The road curved gently, trees blurring on either side as the headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the night. Greg adjusted his speed, set the cruise control, and let his body settle into the seat. His breathing stayed even. His jaw wasn't clenched. His hands didn't shake. That surprised him a little. He waited for anger to arrive in a dramatic rush. It didn't. No images flooded his mind. No urge to scream Alicia's name into the empty car. The betrayal sat inside him like a sealed envelope, heavy, undeniable, but unopened. He understood something important then. Devastation required denial. And he was already past that. He thought about Dominic, about the years of shared beers, borrowed tools, easy laughter, about how trust had made everything simple. Greg felt no urge to replay conversations, to look for signs he'd missed. That kind of thinking served only one purpose: to punish yourself for believing people when they told you who they were. Greg had believed them. That wasn't a flaw. The miles ticked by. Highway signs announced towns he barely noticed. He passed a rest stop and didn't pull in. Fatigue was there, but it was manageable. His body knew how to function when his mind was disciplined. Years of long hours and responsibility had taught him that. As the sky began to lighten at the edges, Greg felt the first true shift settle into place. This was over. Not ending. Not damaged. Over. The word felt clean. He pictured Alicia crying, maybe already rehearsing apologies, maybe justifying everything in a way that let her sleep at night. He felt no satisfaction at the thought, and no urge to intervene. Her emotions were no longer his responsibility. He wasn't cruel enough to enjoy her pain. He was calm enough to step away from it. Greg thought about calling someone, his brother, maybe, or an old friend who lived 3 states away. He imagined how the conversation would go, how concern would creep into their voices, how they'd ask questions he didn't want to answer yet. He decided against it. Silence wasn't avoidance. It was preservation. The road straightened, the horizon slowly filling with pale gray light. The night loosened its grip, revealing fields and quiet houses tucked back from the highway. Greg rolled down the window slightly, letting cool air wash over his face. It grounded him, reminded him he was here, moving forward, not trapped in a moment that was already behind him. By the time the sun began to rise, he wasn't thinking about the call anymore. He was thinking about logistics, about what came next, and how to approach it without noise. He understood, now, that emotion was expensive. It cost focus. It cost leverage. And he wasn't willing to spend either recklessly. He didn't want arguments. Arguments implied there was something left to negotiate emotionally. He didn't want begging. Begging handed power to people who had already misused it. And he didn't want scenes. Scenes gave others the chance to rewrite the story. Greg had spent his life believing that being reasonable would protect him. Now he understood something sharper and more precise. Being composed was protection. As the sun fully cleared the horizon, painting the road ahead in gold and shadow, Greg Foster drove on, no longer as a husband trying to save something, but as a man who had already accepted its end. The shift was complete. Chapter 3, The Empty House and the Note. Greg pulled into the driveway just after 8 in the morning. The house looked the same as it always had, trimmed hedges, closed curtains, the faint scuff mark near the garage door he'd meant to repaint last summer. Nothing dramatic, nothing broken. The quiet was so complete it felt intentional. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, hands resting loosely on the wheel. No one came to the door. No message buzzed his phone. The world didn't react to what had changed, and that felt appropriate. Inside, the air was still. Not stale, just untouched. Greg set his keys on the entry table, exactly where he always did, and listened. The refrigerator hummed. The house ticked and settled. Silence stretched, wide and honest. On the kitchen counter, propped neatly against the fruit bowl, was a folded piece of paper. He didn't rush to it. Greg poured himself a glass of water first, drank half of it, then picked up the note. Alicia's handwriting was careful, rounded, the kind she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. I need some space. I'll be staying with a friend for a bit. Please don't try to contact me. We'll talk soon. No apology. No explanation. No endearment. Greg read it once. Then again. He didn't crumple it. He didn't laugh. He folded it back along the same crease and set it beside the glass. Space, he said aloud, testing the word. It sounded like something decided long before last night. He walked through the house slowly, room by room, not searching, observing. The living room was tidy. Too tidy. The framed photos were still there, but the newest ones were missing. The hallway closet was half empty on her side. Shoes gone. Coats gone. A careful departure. In the bedroom, her dresser drawers were lighter than they should have been. Jewelry case missing. Laptop gone. Greg opened the nightstand on her side. Empty. He nodded once. This wasn't a reaction. It was execution. Greg changed clothes, comfortable ones, then sat at the dining table with his laptop. He didn't pace. He didn't sit on the couch and stare at the wall. He treated the moment the way he treated every serious problem in his life, by breaking it into parts. First, documents. He pulled the fireproof lockbox from the hall closet and set it on the table. Inside were passports, birth certificates, property deeds, insurance policies. He checked them one by one. Everything important was still there. Everything that mattered to ownership and control. Second, finances. Greg logged into their joint account. The balance was lower than expected, not alarming, but noticeable. He pulled statements from the past 6 months and scanned them with practiced efficiency. Patterns emerged quickly. Cash withdrawals. Small, consistent transfers. A credit card he didn't recognize. Interesting, he murmured. He called the bank. Yes, he said calmly when the representative answered. I'd like to freeze all joint accounts effective immediately. I'm an authorized holder. Yes, I understand the process. I'll handle the paperwork today. He gave answers. He listened. He confirmed. When the call ended, nothing in his tone had changed. Next, the credit cards. He canceled the joint ones, left his personal accounts untouched, then opened a new account in his name only and transferred what was legally his. He documented every step, saved confirmation numbers, printed records. Not out of paranoia, out of discipline. Greg had learned early in his career that clarity protected you better than trust ever could. He moved to the filing cabinet in the home office. Mortgage paperwork, vehicle titles, investment summaries. Everything was where it should be. Everything except a thin folder labeled renovation quotes. It was gone. Greg leaned back in the chair, fingers steepled lightly in front of him. Alicia had insisted on managing that project. He had agreed, happy to let her feel involved. Now he wondered what else she'd insisted on handling. He checked the property records online. Ownership was clear, clean, in his name. Good. He stood and walked through the garage. His tools were untouched. His car, obviously still there. But the spare key rack by the door was missing one. He exhaled slowly through his nose. This hadn't been decided overnight. This had been planned, coordinated, reduced to steps. Greg returned to the kitchen and sat again, opening a fresh document on his laptop. He didn't title it Betrayal or Divorce. He labeled it simply Timeline. Dates, transactions, missing items, notes. He wrote without emotion, the way he'd write a report for work. Facts only. No speculation. No adjectives. At one point, his phone buzzed. Alicia. He watched it ring until it stopped. Then he set the phone face down. He didn't need answers. He needed accuracy. By late morning, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like an office after hours, familiar, but stripped of warmth. Greg didn't resent that. It made thinking easier. He folded the note again and placed it in the lockbox. Space, he repeated quietly. The word didn't offend him anymore. It clarified things. As he shut the laptop and stood, one conclusion settled firmly into place, heavy but undeniable. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan, and the betrayal didn't feel emotional. It felt organized. Chapter 4, The Phone That Changes Everything. Greg didn't go looking for it. That was the part that stayed with him later. The fact that he hadn't been hunting for secrets, hadn't been tearing the house apart in desperation. He was returning a box of old chargers to the hall closet, the kind of small, practical task that gave his hands something to do while his mind stayed clear. The box snagged on something near the back shelf. Greg frowned slightly and pulled it forward. Behind it, taped to the wall with careful precision, was a slim black pouch. Not dusty, not forgotten, recently placed. He peeled it free. Inside was a phone. Not his. Not the one Alicia used every day. No case, no cracks, fully charged. A backup. Greg stood still, the house quiet around him, and weighed the phone in his palm. There was no rush of adrenaline, no spike of triumph. Just a tightening behind his eyes, the kind that came when a theory crossed the line into certainty. He carried it to the kitchen and sat down at the table. The phone lit up when he pressed the button. No passcode. That alone told him everything. The home screen was bare. No photos displayed. No widgets. Just the essentials. Greg opened the Messages app. The first name at the top made his jaw set. Susie, his wife's closest friend. The one who had hugged him at barbecues. Who had told him more than once how lucky Alicia was to have such a steady husband. The thread stretched back months. Greg scrolled slowly, reading without blinking. He'll be out of town again next week. Perfect. Same hotel. Yeah, he never changes. Another message followed, a photo attachment. Greg didn't open it immediately. He read on. Just be careful. If he ever gets suspicious, he won't. He's predictable. Greg exhaled quietly through his nose and tapped the photo. Alicia, smiling into a mirror that wasn't theirs. Dominic's arm visible around her waist. Timestamp from 4 months ago. Greg closed the image and set the phone down for a moment. He folded his hands together, fingers interlaced, and stared at the grain of the table. The affair wasn't new. It wasn't impulsive. It had been built carefully, brick by brick, behind his back. When he picked the phone up again, his movements were steadier, more deliberate. He opened another thread. Dominic. Not a surprise. But the tone was different here. Less romantic. More strategic. We need to be smart about this. He can't come out looking like the good guy. Small town. People talk. Greg's eyes narrowed slightly. He scrolled. If he pushes back, we go with the plan. What plan? The abuse angle. He's quiet. Nobody will doubt it. Greg felt something shift then, not in his chest, but deeper. A cold awareness settling into place. He reread the messages more carefully now. We document everything. Bruises can be explained. Susie knows how to phrase it. Greg leaned back in his chair, the phone held loosely in his hand. For the first time since the call at 1:00 a.m., the situation revealed its true shape. This wasn't just betrayal. It was preparation. He opened the voice notes. Alicia's voice filled the kitchen, casual and familiar, as if she were standing a few feet away. I just can't do this anymore, she said in one recording. He controls everything. The money. The schedule. It's like I don't exist. Greg closed his eyes briefly. Another voice note played automatically. Susie this time. Just stick to that. Emotional control is still control. Judges eat that up. Greg paused the recording. That was the moment the marriage officially ceased to matter. He wasn't dealing with a wife who had fallen out of love. He was dealing with people who were willing to erase him if it benefited them. Greg straightened in his chair. He didn't shout. He didn't slam the phone down. He didn't feel the urge to drive anywhere or confront anyone. Those reactions belonged to men who still thought this was about feelings. Greg opened his laptop. He began methodically. Screenshot. Save. Label. Each message captured with timestamps intact. Each photo archived. Each voice note exported. He created folders, subfolders, backups. He emailed copies to an account Alicia didn't know existed. He uploaded everything to encrypted storage. He documented where each file came from and when. As he worked, he spoke occasionally, quietly, to himself. Pattern, he said, noting how Susie had guided conversations. Coordination, he murmured, marking how Dominic's messages shifted before each of Greg's trips. Intent, he whispered, saving the messages about false accusations. Hours passed without him noticing. At one point, he replayed a voice note where Alicia laughed softly and said, he'd never see this coming. Greg didn't flinch. He added it to the timeline. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen table looked like a workstation. Laptop open, notes arranged neatly, the phone charging beside him. Greg moved with the precision of a man who understood stakes. He wasn't angry. Anger would have rushed him. He wasn't heartbroken. Heartbreak would have slowed him down. What he felt was focus. When he finally leaned back, rubbing his temples once, he understood something with absolute clarity. This had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They weren't trying to leave him. They were trying to destroy him. Greg looked at the phone one last time before locking it away, his reflection faint in the darkened screen. This was no longer about marriage. It was about survival. Chapter 5, let them talk. The rumors didn't arrive all at once. They seeped in, quiet and persistent, the way damp finds its way through walls you thought were solid. Greg noticed them first in the pauses. At the grocery store, the cashier hesitated before asking if he needed a receipt. At the coffee shop, a woman he'd known for years offered a tight smile instead of her usual warmth. Conversations lowered in volume when he passed. People looked at him, then away, then back again with the kind of curiosity that pretended to be concern. He understood immediately what was happening. He let it happen. One afternoon, while loading lumber into his truck at the hardware store, a man from his old bowling league cleared his throat and said, "You holding up okay, Greg?" "I am," Greg replied evenly, tightening the strap and checking it twice. "Thanks for asking." The man nodded, clearly waiting for more. A denial. A story. Something emotional enough to repeat later. Greg gave him nothing. He drove away without checking his mirrors. By the end of the week, the narrative had taken shape without his participation. He was cold. He was controlling. He had driven Alicia away. There were phrases people liked to use, emotionally distant, hard to live with, not the man he pretended to be. Greg heard none of it directly. That was how small towns worked. Information traveled fastest when it was whispered just out of reach. At the gym, the front desk attendant hesitated before scanning his card. "Everything okay?" Greg asked politely. Yes. Of course," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Have a good workout." He did. He kept his routine unchanged. Same arrival time. Same nod to the older man who used the elliptical beside him. Same measured sets. Same controlled breathing. When Dominic wasn't there, and he rarely was now, Greg noticed a few heads turning in his direction, eyes tracking him with interest. He didn't stare back. He showered, dressed, and left without comment. Behind the scenes, he worked quietly. His first stop was the bank. The manager, a woman named Karen who had handled his accounts for over a decade, greeted him with professional warmth. Greg closed the office door behind him and set a folder on her desk. "I want to make you aware of a developing situation," he said calmly. "No accusations, just documentation." Karen adjusted her glasses. "All right." Greg slid over printed statements, timestamps highlighted, accounts already frozen. "I'm concerned about potential misrepresentation," he continued. "I want all communication noted and any unusual requests flagged." Karen scanned the pages, her expression tightening, not with alarm, but recognition. "This is thorough," she said carefully. Greg nodded. "It needs to be." She looked up at him. "If anyone attempts to access funds improperly, we'll document it immediately." "That's all I'm asking," Greg replied. "No dramatics, no raised voices, just facts." Next came the HR departments. Greg didn't storm offices or send long emails. He scheduled brief meetings. 15 minutes, 20 at most. "I'm involved in a personal legal matter," he told them. "There may be claims made. I want to ensure you have context if that happens." "Claims of what nature?" one HR representative asked. Greg paused, then placed a slim folder on the desk. "Potentially false," he said, and preemptively documented. They read. They asked questions. Greg answered with restraint, never editorializing, never speculating. When he left those offices, the atmosphere had shifted, not in his favor publicly, but in something more durable. Credibility. At the gym, he requested a private meeting with management. The owner, a broad-shouldered man named Paul, listened with crossed arms as Greg spoke. "I don't want special treatment," Greg said. "I want accurate records." Paul frowned as he scanned the screenshots. "This kind of thing causes trouble." "I'm aware," Greg replied. "That's why I'm here before it does." Paul exhaled slowly. "We'll keep an eye out." "Thank you." Greg shook his hand and left. He never once said Alicia's name in anger. Never described Dominic with bitterness. Never labeled Susie anything at all. He didn't need to. The document spoke clearly enough on their own. Meanwhile, the town kept talking. A neighbor waved, less enthusiastically. A coworker asked if he was doing okay at home, with the careful tone people used when they already thought they knew the answer. Greg smiled, thanked them, and changed the subject. At night, he cooked for himself, cleaned the kitchen, reviewed his files. His phone remained mostly silent. When messages came from people fishing for information, he responded politely and briefly. "I'm handling it. I appreciate your concern. Everything's documented." The words became armor. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. Karen from the bank called. "Greg," she said, "someone attempted to access joint funds this morning." "Was it successful?" he asked. "No," she replied. And the request raised flags. "We documented it fully." "Thank you," Greg said. "That's all I needed." At the gym, Paul nodded at him with something like respect. Some questions came up. Paul said quietly. They didn't go far. Greg inclined his head. "I appreciate you keeping it professional." Across town, confidence began to erode. Susie stopped making eye contact in public. Dominic's truck disappeared from its usual spots. Alicia didn't show up anywhere Greg frequented. The whispers changed tone, less certainty now, more confusion. Greg noticed and kept silent. He didn't correct the rumors. He didn't defend himself. He allowed the story to wobble under its own weight, unsupported by facts. One evening at the grocery store again, the same cashier from before handed him his receipt and said, Have a good night, Mr. Foster. There was no hesitation this time. Greg smiled faintly. You too. He walked out into the cooling air, groceries in hand, posture relaxed. Inside, everything was aligned. Let them talk, he thought. He had time, and patience, and proof. Chapter 6, Controlled Exposure. Greg chose the timing carefully. Late afternoon, when offices were still open, but the day's momentum had slowed. When people were tired enough to slip, but not frantic enough to overreact. He sat at the kitchen table, a legal pad aligned with the edge, his phone face down beside it. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin, even lines. Nothing in the room felt rushed. He flipped the phone over and dialed Dominic's number. It rang twice. Greg, Dominic answered too quickly. His voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. What's going on? Greg leaned back in his chair. I wanted to talk, he said calmly. Now seemed like a good time. There was a short, uneven laugh on the other end. About what? Greg didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough to be noticed, not long enough to feel aggressive. About the hotel, Greg said finally. The mirror. The timestamps. Another pause. This one heavier. I don't know what you think, you. For months, Greg interrupted gently. That's how far back the messages go. The sound Dominic made wasn't quite a gasp, but it wasn't steady breathing either. You went through her phone? Dominic asked. Not the one you're thinking of, Greg replied. The other one. Silence fell hard and fast. Greg imagined Dominic standing somewhere, garage, driveway, maybe a break room, try to rearrange his understanding of the situation. Greg didn't press. He didn't need to. Look, Dominic said finally, his voice lower now, this doesn't have to get ugly. Greg smiled faintly, though no one could see it. I agree, he said. That's why I'm calling. Dominic exhaled. What do you want? I want you to understand something, Greg replied. I know who coordinated it. I know who suggested what. I know what language was being practiced. Dominic swallowed audibly. You don't know everything. I know enough, Greg said. And I know timelines. You're threatening me, Dominic snapped, a brittle attempt at confidence. No, Greg said evenly. I'm orienting you. The line went quiet again. Greg could hear faint background noise, traffic, a door opening and closing. Dominic was moving. I'm not asking for apologies, Greg continued. I'm not asking for explanations. I don't need either. So what is this? Dominic demanded. This is me telling you, Greg said, that I won't be surprised by anything you try next. He let that sit. You don't get to rewrite me, Greg added. And you don't get to improvise. Dominic's voice dropped. You're acting like you have leverage. I'm acting like I know what I have, Greg corrected. Another breath. Shakier this time. Greg, Dominic said, attempting a new tone, almost friendly. We've known each other a long time. Greg nodded to himself. That's why I'm giving you this courtesy. What courtesy? This call, Greg said. No witnesses. No recordings on your end. Just information. Dominic didn't respond. Greg ended the call. He placed the phone face down and sat quietly for a moment, listening to the house settle around him. His pulse was steady. His hands were relaxed. The conversation had cost him nothing. That was how he knew it had been effective. An hour later, Greg made another call. This one was to Alicia's employer. He didn't disguise his identity. He didn't exaggerate. He asked for HR and waited patiently while the call transferred. This is Greg Foster, he said when the line connected. I'm calling to provide context in advance of any potential claims that may come your way. There was a pause, then a cautious reply. What kind of claims? Greg chose his words carefully. Personal matters sometimes spill into professional spaces, he said. I want to ensure any information you receive is weighed against documented facts. Do you have documentation? The representative asked. I do, Greg replied, and I can provide it if needed. Another pause. Paper rustled on the other end. Thank you for notifying us, the voice said. We'll note this. That's all I'm asking, Greg said. When the call ended, he didn't feel satisfaction. He felt alignment. That evening, the ripples reached him indirectly. Susie texted, Greg, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Can we talk? He read the message once and set the phone down without replying. Minutes later, another message arrived. I never meant for things to go this far. Greg didn't answer. The The third message came an hour later. Please. He muted the thread. Across town, Dominic unraveled. Greg didn't see it directly, but he felt it in the sudden changes. A voicemail left and deleted before it could finish. A missed call at 11:43 p.m. A second one at 11:46. Then nothing. The confidence Dominic had carried so easily on the phone days earlier was gone, replaced by urgency, by fear of unknown variables. That was the point. Greg didn't block anyone. He didn't issue warnings. He simply became unreachable in the way that mattered most. Emotionally, when Alicia finally called, her voice tight and controlled, Greg listened without interrupting. You've been talking to people, she said. I've been documenting, Greg replied. You're making this worse. No, Greg said calmly. I'm preventing surprises. She fell silent. You don't need to do this, Alicia said after a moment. I do, Greg replied. You just didn't think I would. The call ended shortly after. Greg stood at the sink later that night, rinsing a plate, watching water bead and slide away. He felt no urge to defend himself, no urge to explain his side to anyone who hadn't asked directly. The power shift wasn't dramatic. There were no public confrontations, no raised voices, just a gradual rebalancing. People who had spoken confidently now hesitated. Messages softened. Questions replaced assumptions. And Greg remained exactly the same in public, polite, measured, unremarkable. Inside, the board had been reset. He wasn't chasing control. He was occupying it, quietly, deliberately. And as the night settled in, Greg understood that the balance had begun to tilt, not through force, but through certainty. Chapter 7, The Wife Comes Home. Alicia's car pulled into the driveway just after sunset. Greg saw it through the living room window and didn't move right away. He finished rinsing his coffee mug, set it upside down on the drying rack, and wiped his hands on a towel. His pulse didn't change. He had known this moment was coming. People who lose control always return to the place they think still belongs to them. The front door opened with her familiar key. Greg, she called, forcing brightness into her voice. We need to talk. He stepped into the hallway, calm, composed, already centered. I agree, he said. Come into the kitchen. That alone unsettled her. She had expected shouting, questions, anger sharp enough to cut with. Instead, he sounded like he was calling a meeting. She followed him, eyes scanning the house as if checking for damage. Everything was clean, orderly, untouched. That bothered her more than chaos would have. She dropped her purse onto a chair. Okay, she said, folding her arms. Before you say anything, I just want you to know. Greg raised a hand, not sharply, just enough to stop her. Before we start, he said evenly, you should sit down. I'm fine, she snapped. He didn't argue. He took his seat at the table instead, setting a thin folder in front of him. Alicia's phone buzzed in her hand. She frowned and tapped the screen. That's strange, she muttered. My card just declined. Greg nodded once. All joint accounts are frozen. Her head snapped up. You can't do that. I already did, he replied calmly. Legally. She stared at him, color draining from her face. I need access to my money. You need access to our money, Greg corrected. And that's no longer an option. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She swallowed. What is this? She demanded. Some kind of punishment? No, Greg said. It's a boundary. She laughed, sharp and brittle. You think you could just cut me off and I'll what? Come crawling back. I don't expect you to come back at all, Greg said. That part is already finished. He slid the folder across the table. Alicia didn't touch it. What's that? Divorce papers, he said. Filed this morning. The silence that followed was thick and disorienting. Alicia stared at the folder as if it might explode. You filed without telling me, she whispered. There was nothing to discuss, Greg replied. Her voice rose. After everything I've given to this marriage, Greg looked at her then, not with anger, with clarity. You gave up on it months ago, he said. I just caught up. Her hands trembled as she finally opened the folder. She flipped through the pages quickly, breath coming faster. This is insane, she said. You don't even know the whole story. I know enough, Greg said. She slammed the folder shut. Oh yeah? Then say it. Greg didn't hesitate. I know about the hotel, he said. I know about Dominic. I know it's been going on for months. Alicia froze. And I know, he continued, about the conversations with Susie, the coaching, the language you practiced. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to him. You went through my phone? Not the one you carry, Greg said quietly. Her face went pale. I know about the backup phone, he said. I know about the photos, the voice notes, and I know about the plan. Her voice dropped to a whisper. What plan? The one where I become controlling. Then abusive, Greg said. The one where bruises get explained and timelines get rewritten. Alicia's knees buckled. She sat down hard in the chair. That's not, she began, then stopped. Her breath hitched. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Greg said. You were preparing to destroy me. Tears spilled over, sudden and uncontrolled. I was scared, she sobbed. I didn't know how to leave. So you decided to lie, Greg said evenly, and frame me. She shook her head, crying harder now. It got out of control. Greg didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He stayed exactly where he was. Which is why I'm giving you a choice, he said. She looked up at him through tears. What choice? Option 1, Greg said. You sign the papers. You take your personal belongings. You walk away quietly. No accusations. No retaliation. No contact. And option 2, she whispered. Greg met her eyes. Everything becomes public. Every message. Every recording. Every plan. Her face collapsed inward. She covered her mouth with her hands, shoulders shaking. You'd really do that? She asked. I won't need to, Greg said. You'll choose. She cried openly now, the kind of sobbing that came from realizing there was no angle left to play. No leverage. No emotional appeal that would change the outcome. I loved you, she said weakly. Greg nodded once. Once. She looked at him, then truly looked, and seemed to realize something she hadn't before. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt in a way she could fix. He was finished. You're not even yelling, she said, almost accusingly. There's nothing to yell about, Greg replied. This isn't a fight. She wiped her face with trembling hands. So that's it. Greg stood, smoothing his shirt. That's it. He gathered the folder and placed it back in front of her, aligning it carefully. You don't need to explain yourself anymore, he said. You don't need my forgiveness. And I don't need your apology. He paused at the doorway, then added, without malice, the marriage ends here. And he walked out of the kitchen, leaving Alicia alone with the papers, the silence, and the understanding that there was nothing left to negotiate. Chapter 8, The Group Reckoning. They met in a place that felt neutral by design, a small conference room at a rented office space on the edge of town. Glass walls, gray carpet, a long table with 4 chairs. No personal history clinging to the corners. No comfort. Greg arrived first. He chose the chair at the end of the table, set his folder down, and checked his watch. He didn't pace. He didn't rehearse speeches. Everything he needed was already arranged, indexed, and ready. When the door opened, Alicia came in first. She looked smaller than Greg remembered, shoulders drawn in, eyes red but dry. She didn't meet his gaze. She sat 2 chairs away, leaving a space between them as if it might absorb tension. Susie followed, posture stiff, lips pressed tight. She offered a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dominic came last. He hesitated in the doorway, scanning the room, taking in Greg's calm like it was a foreign object. He pulled out a chair opposite Greg and sat, crossing his arms in a defensive reflex he didn't seem aware of. Well, Susie said, forcing lightness. This feels dramatic. Greg didn't respond. He waited until the door closed and the room settled into silence. Then he opened the folder and slid copies down the table, one to each of them. Before anyone speaks, Greg said calmly, I want to be clear about how this works. Dominic scoffed. You don't get to control. Greg raised a hand. Not sharply, just enough. You'll have time to respond, he said. After you listen. The room quieted. Greg tapped the first page. These are timelines. Dates, locations, transactions. No opinions. Just records. Alicia stared at the paper without touching it. Susie flipped hers open, her confidence evaporating as she scanned the highlighted lines. Where did you get this? She asked. I documented what existed, Greg replied. Nothing more. Dominic leaned forward. You're blowing this out of proportion. Greg turned a page and slid a second document forward. Those are screenshots, he said. Backups are timestamped. Dominic's jaw tightened. Greg continued, his voice even, unhurried. These are voice notes. Transcriptions included. Originals preserved. Susie's hand trembled as she set the pages down. This was private. It stopped being private when you planned to use it publicly, Greg said. Alicia finally looked up. We said things we didn't mean. Greg met her gaze briefly. You practiced them. Silence fell again, heavier now. I'm not here to argue intent, Greg went on. I'm here to establish outcomes. Dominic laughed without humor. You think you can just scare us into, this isn't fear, Greg said. It's math. He slid the final document forward. These are the papers. Alicia's breath hitched. Here are the boundaries, Greg said. They're simple. He lifted one finger. You sign. A second finger. There is no contact after today. No messages. No intermediaries. A third. No retaliation. No accusations. No creative interpretations. Susie shook her head. You can't expect us to just... Greg didn't raise his voice. I expect you to choose. Dominic leaned back, eyes narrowed. And if we don't, Greg folded his hands. Then everything you see here becomes visible to the people who decide outcomes in this town. What does that mean? Alicia whispered. Greg answered without hesitation. Employers, banks, boards, social circles that pretend not to notice until they're forced to. Susie swallowed. You'd ruin us. Greg tilted his head slightly. I wouldn't do anything. I would release information. That's the same thing, Dominic snapped. No, Greg said. It isn't. He let the distinction sit. This town doesn't forget, Greg continued. It just pretends. Exposure removes the pretending. Alicia pressed her palms flat against the table. You're enjoying this. Greg looked at her steadily. I'm ending it. Susie's voice cracked. We never thought you'd. That, Greg said, is the problem. Dominic pushed his chair back slightly. You're acting like you're untouchable. I'm acting like I prepared, Greg replied. The room fell quiet again. Even Dominic had no immediate response. Greg glanced at his watch. Take 5 minutes, he said. Read everything. They did. Pages rustled. Breathing changed. The weight of consequence settled into the room like a pressure change before a storm. Susie was the first to speak. If we sign, she said carefully, you walk away? Yes, Greg said. And you won't, she gestured vaguely. No contact, Greg repeated. No commentary. No retaliation. Alicia's voice was small. You won't talk about me. I won't need to, Greg said. Dominic stared at the table, jaw clenched. This is extortion. Greg shook his head once. It's containment. Another stretch of silence. Alicia picked up the pen first. Her hand shook as she signed. Susie followed, her signature sharp and rushed. Dominic hesitated the longest. When he finally signed, he did it hard enough to dent the paper. Greg collected the documents, aligned them neatly, and placed them back into his folder. He stood. There was no victory speech, no final warning. Today ends here, Greg said. For all of us. Alicia opened her mouth as if to say something, an apology, maybe, or a last attempt at connection. Greg didn't wait for it. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out without looking back. Behind him, the room stayed silent. Strategy had done what emotion never could, and silence had said everything screaming never would. Chapter 9, Desperation and Exposure. The bar was dim in the way only weekday afternoons ever were, half-lit, half-forgotten, suspended between lunch crowds and evening regulars. Greg chose it deliberately. Neutral ground. No history. No witnesses who care enough to remember details. Alicia sat in the booth already when he arrived, a glass of wine untouched in front of her. Her shoulders were hunched, eyes darting every time the door opened. She looked like someone waiting for a verdict. Greg slid into the seat across from her and placed the folder on the table. You came, she said, voice thin. I said I would, Greg replied. She reached for the folder, then pulled her hand back as if it burned. Do we really have to do this here? Yes, Greg said simply. Her lips trembled. You couldn't wait until somewhere private? This is private enough, he said, and public enough to keep us honest. She let out a shaky breath and opened the folder. The papers were exactly where she remembered them. Final. Clean. Unforgiving. Her pen hovered. If I sign, she whispered, you won't release anything? Greg held her gaze. If you follow the agreement. No accusations. No retaliation. No contact. Tears welled. I've lost everything. Greg didn't correct her. He just said, you're losing the marriage. That's everything to me, she said. It stopped being everything when you planned to burn it down, he replied quietly. Her shoulders collapsed inward. She signed. The pen scratched across the page, final and irreversible. When she was done, she slid the papers toward him with trembling fingers. Please, she said, breaking. Please don't ruin me. Greg closed the folder. I won't, he said, as long as you don't force my hand. She nodded repeatedly, tears streaking down her face. I won't. I swear. Greg stood. Then this is goodbye. She reached for his hand, desperation flashing across her face. He stepped back before she could touch him, and walked out. Dominic didn't handle loss quietly. The first voicemail came 2 nights later. You think you won? Dominic's voice snarled through the speaker. You think this makes you some kind of hero? Greg listened once, then saved it. The second message was louder, angrier, less controlled. You're not untouchable, Greg. Don't forget that. Saved. The third wasn't even trying to hide the threat. I see you. I know where you are. Greg didn't block the number. He turned on recording. When Dominic showed up in person, it was almost a relief. Greg was loading groceries into his trunk when Dominic's truck screeched to a stop nearby. Dominic jumped out, face flushed, movements jerky. You ruined my life, Dominic hissed, closing the distance. Greg kept his phone in his pocket, recording silently. You did that yourself, Greg said calmly. Dominic laughed, wild and sharp. You think people believe your quiet little act. I don't need them to believe me, Greg replied. I need them to hear you. Dominic stepped closer. You're dead if you don't back off. Greg met his eyes. Say that again. Dominic did. Clear, loud, undeniable. Greg nodded once. Thank you. Dominic froze. For just a second. Then he realized. Greg didn't argue further. He closed his trunk, got into his car, and drove away while Dominic stood in the parking lot, shouting after him. The exposure wasn't dramatic. Greg sent one email. To Dominic's employer. No commentary. No accusations. Just an attached audio file and timestamps. A brief note for your records. The response came the next morning. We are placing Mr. Dominic on administrative suspension pending review. At the gym, Greg noticed Dominic's access card no longer worked. Management didn't explain. They didn't need to. At the bar where Dominic used to hold court, his stool sat empty. Conversations paused when his name came up, then moved on quickly, as if touching something unpleasant. Susie stopped showing up altogether. The town adjusted. Stories that once painted Greg as cold now sounded uncertain. Then quiet. Then replaced by raised eyebrows and unfinished sentences when Dominic's name surfaced. Greg didn't correct anyone. He didn't offer his side. He didn't need to. Facts moved faster than rumors once they were set free. At the grocery store, the cashier smiled again. At the gym, nods returned. At work, no one asked questions anymore. They didn't need to. Greg moved through all unchanged. Same posture, same calm, same restraint. Desperation had made noise. Exposure had made consequences. And Greg let the truth do what it did best, speak for itself. Chapter 10. The Storm and the Silence. The storm arrived without warning. One moment the night was heavy and still. The next it was split open by thunder that rattled the windows and sent rain slamming against the roof in sheets. Greg stood at the kitchen sink, watching water streak down the glass, counting seconds between lightning and sound the way he used to as a kid. 3 seconds, then 2. The power flickered but held. He didn't turn on extra lights. He never did anymore. That was why he heard it. The faint scrape near the back door, almost lost beneath the rain. Metal against metal. Careful. Testing. Greg didn't move. He reached calmly into his pocket and unlocked his phone. Recording on. Screen dark. The scrape came again, louder this time. Then the unmistakable crack of wood giving way. The door burst inward. Dominic stumbled inside, soaked, eyes wild, chest heaving like he'd been running from something or toward it. Rainwater pooled on the floor beneath his boots. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating his face. "You thought you could end me," Dominic spat. Greg stood by the counter, hands visible, posture relaxed. "You've broken my home," Greg said evenly. "That's a felony." Dominic laughed, a sharp, broken sound. "Call the cops then." "I am," Greg replied. Dominic froze. "What?" Greg tilted his phone slightly. The small red dot blinked. "You've been on speaker since you crossed the threshold," Greg said, "and the system auto-uploads." Dominic's expression twisted. Rage fought panic. "You smug bastard," Dominic snarled, stepping closer. "You think recording saves you?" Greg didn't retreat. "It preserves the truth." Thunder crashed overhead. The lights flickered again, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. Dominic lunged. Greg stepped sideways, controlled, letting Dominic's momentum carry him past. A chair toppled. Glass shattered. "Stay back," Greg said. Dominic spun around, fists clenched. "You took everything from me." "No," Greg replied. "I stopped you from taking more." Dominic charged again, reckless now. Greg raised his arm defensively as Dominic swung. The blow glanced off his shoulder, pain flaring but manageable. Greg didn't strike back. He backed away, keeping distance, voice steady. "You're making this worse," Greg said. "Shut up," Dominic roared. Another crash of thunder shook the house. Outside, a neighbor's security light snapped on, flooding the kitchen with harsh white light through the broken door. Dominic hesitated. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Greg hadn't called them just now. He'd called them minutes ago, silently, when the first lock broke. "You planned this," Dominic said, breathing hard. Greg met his eyes. "I planned for survival." Dominic's shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him all at once, replaced by something uglier, fear. "They believe you," Dominic whispered. "Everyone believes you." "They believe evidence," Greg said. The sirens grew louder. Dominic backed toward the door, slipping on rainwater. "This isn't over." Greg didn't respond. Red and blue lights splashed across the walls moments later. Doors slammed. Commands were shouted. "Hand where we can see them." Dominic raised his hands too late. Officers rushed in, weapons drawn, voices sharp and controlled. Dominic tried to speak over them, words tumbling out in incoherent bursts. "He set me up. Sir, get on the ground." "Now." Greg stood still, phone still recording. They cuffed Dominic on the kitchen floor, rain mixing with sweat and dirt. One officer approached Greg. "Are you injured?" "My shoulder," Greg said. "I'll be fine." The officer nodded. "We got everything on record. You did the right thing calling it in early." Greg didn't correct him. He watched as Dominic was dragged to his feet, face pale, eyes searching Greg's one last time. Greg didn't look away. The aftermath was quiet. Too quiet for drama. Dominic was charged. Breaking and entering. Assault. Threats. The recordings filled in the gaps neatly. There were no misunderstandings left to argue over. The divorce finalized a week later. Alicia didn't attend the hearing in person. Her signature was already there, clean and compliant. She sent no messages. Neither did Susie. Reputations collapsed the way buildings do after their foundations are exposed, slowly at first, then all at once. Greg's name never rose with theirs. He returned to his routines. Work, gym, grocery store. Silence. Neighbors nodded again. Some avoided eye contact. Some offered quiet sympathy without words. Greg accepted none of it. He fixed the door himself. On the first clear night after the storm, he sat on the porch with a glass of water, listening to crickets and distant traffic. The house behind him felt empty, but not hollow. Just open. There was no rush of victory, no satisfaction, no surge of revenge, only stillness. Greg breathed in, then out. Quiet men aren't weak, he thought. They're patient, and betrayal didn't need rage. Only consequences.